The Camino Real is the road that led to the founding of Texas. We wouldn't be calling Texas, Texas without it today. My name is Stephen Gonzales. I'm Executive Director of El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association. There's a lot of Camino stuff here in central San Antonio. Originally it was a Native American footpath that was later followed by Spanish explorers, French settlers, Tejanos that lived here in Texas. There were even Anglo-American settlers and African Americans who came down the road. So this has now become known even as a route of the southern route of the Underground Railroad. San Antonio was originally called Yan Anguana by the Payaya people, which they were a Coahuiltecan people, a band of the Coahuiltecan people. Yan Anguana means the land of living waters. And so when the Spanish arrived here, there were already, again, thousands of native peoples.
My name is Travis Boley with the Oregon-California Trails Association, and today we're in San Antonio, Texas at San Pedro Springs Park. It was here in 1718 that the Spanish founded what became known as the city of San Antonio, and by 1731, Canary Islanders had settled here. 56 Canary Islanders. Canary Islands were a possession of Spain, and they were brought here to settle as well. And that's really kind of the beginning of the civilian population of San Antonio.
The Spanish used the Camino to come up here all the way from Mexico City. Lots of different goods and supplies flowed along the Camino. Wine and tobacco and beans and flour and things like, cattle and goats and stuff like that the Spanish would have brought as well. San Antonio is part of Nueva España, or New Spain. Most people haven't heard of New Spain, right? We've all heard of New England, maybe even New France. But most people don't realize that the southwestern U.S. is Nueva España, it's New Spain. And so San Antonio, Santa Fe, even Tucson and Los Angeles at the far end in San Francisco, those kinds of places were areas within New Spain. The National Park Service considers the period of historic significance for the Camino Real to be 1680 to 1845. And so, the beginning of it is really that whole French LaSalle, De Leon with the Spanish, and the Spanish trying to root the French out of here.
On the west side of the park is a stone structure that is the base of the cannon mount. The cannon mount comes from the Alamo. It was removed here to the park today. The cannon is gone, but the mount is still there for it. The Alamo today is a couple of miles to our southeast, but this is where the mission originally was. This was the first Presidio, the first civilian settlement, and in 1729, it was designated a park by King Philip V of Spain, making this the oldest park in the continental United States.
Also here at San Antonio, it was at a defensible point for the Spanish to maintain a line of forts. So there was a line of Presidios, which we are standing in front of one of them right now. This is Presidio San Antonio de Bejar right here. This line of Presidios stretched all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of California. They would meet in the middle along the Camino Real. They'd camp for the night, then they would ride back to the Presidios the next day, and that's what they did to patrol that line to make sure that just unwanteds from other areas weren't coming in. That could have been Anglo settlers from America, that could have been native peoples or otherwise that they were trying to keep out.
Camino Real de los Tejas is also really important in this part of Texas. It runs from down into Mexico into eastern Louisiana, and of course the 5 Spanish missions that make up San Antonio were all part of that. 4 of those today are managed as San Antonio Missions National Historic Park by the National Parks.
The way Texas really became to get settled was because of the perceived threat of the French by the Spanish. So there had been other Spanish expeditions and people who had been through here in earlier times, but it really wasn't until the French established Fort St. Louis, and that was in 1685, that the Spanish really began focusing on Texas because of that perceived French threat. So they started sending out entradas or expeditions in order to root the French out of here. And so a man named Alonso de Leon was charged with doing that. He did a couple of different expeditions to try to find LaSalle's fort, and he probably got as far as Baffin Bay, which is near Kingsville, Texas. And he saw it as this large, impassable body of water, and he just said, you know what? These are just rumors of the French being out here. So they turned around and they went home. But yet those rumors persisted that there were white men living among the Native Americans. And so a year later, they were able to find a Frenchman named Jean Jury And so with Jean-Jury in tow, they were able to find the ruins of Fort St. Louis, and it was in a complete shambles. There were 3 French people who the Native Americans had killed, plus the Spanish found French cannons at that time, which they buried in case the French came back. Famed Spanish colonial historian Carlos Castaneda states that it truly marks the beginnings of Texas, because that's the first time that these expeditions were penetrating as far as the Guadalupe River. And so that was really what led to the blazing of the Camino itself. Technically speaking, the Spanish settlers that were out here along the Camino in Texas and Louisiana, in a very technical sense, they were only supposed to accept their goods from the Spanish government coming out of Mexico City. But that would have taken 6 to 8 months for those supplies to arrive up here, particularly in Far East Texas from Mexico City. And so the people who were out at Los Adais, as an example, the old Spanish provincial capital, they had the French 15 miles away in Natchitoches, at their French fort. And so even though they weren't supposed to be trading with the French, there's huge amounts of evidence of trading between the French and the Spanish out there between Los Adais and Fort St. John Baptiste, because they were 15 miles apart. And even though in some technical sense they were enemies, they were really kind of, casual frenemies that were, kind of hanging out at times and trading and interacting and things like that. Plus you had all the native peoples as well that they were trading with along the way.
San Antonio is kind of uniquely situated geographically here at the south edge of that escarpment that is the Edwards Plateau, and there's a number of springs all along the plateau that flow out to the south. You're also at the very western edge of the Gulf Coast Plain, and that kind of makes up the east part of the city. And then the south part of the city is what's known as the brushlands, where the mesquite trees grow. And then just beyond that is the beginning of the Chihuahuan Desert. So you have those 4 different zones, these ecological zones that come together here and make this a really unique geographical location.
Well, yeah, San Antonio is a place that has a lot of ecological advantages for being here. There's a lot of water. There's the San Antonio River, flows from springs such as San Pedro Springs and the Blue Hole. There are very large springs that come out of the foot of the Balcones Escarpment here, which is the edge of the Edwards Plateau. So San Antonio sits right at the edge of the escarpment with the Edwards Plateau just to the north of us. We have the Blackland Prairie to the east. We have the South Texas brushland to the south. And then not too far to the west, you have the Chihuahuan Desert environment starting to come in. So here in San Antonio, you've got water, you've got the stone from the plateau to build structures with, you've got the wood from the plateau to use for fire and cooking and warmth, plus you've also got the Blackland prairies where they could grow crops and graze their cattle and that kind of thing. And then you just see these springs. If you've ever traveled through the landscape of Texas, you can see why that old route is there, because again, it was the easiest path to get a direct line from San Antonio towards the El Paso and eventually California area.
Again, for the same reason we mentioned earlier, is it's following the escarpment of the Edwards Plateau, basically roughly following Highway 90 west out of San Antonio. There's a number of springs all along the edge of that escarpment, feeding creeks and rivers, thus making it possible to travel through an otherwise harsh climate because there was water.
And it does follow that southern route of California. It's just the easiest way, really, to go from here out west without having to cross major mountain ranges and things like that. Again, from here to places like Brackettville and then eventually over to Del Rio, you're pretty much following the foot of the Balcones Escarpment, right? The foot of the Edwards Plateau.